Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today we're joined by noted Canada-U.S. relations expert, Professor Christopher Sands. He's the director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and professor of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. From 1993 to 2007, Professor Sands was a fellow and director of Canada projects at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and from 2007 until 2016, he was a senior fellow and director of the Initiative on Northern American Competitiveness at the Hudson Institute. He's also from Detroit, which happens to be in the middle of a bit of a battleground state right now. So Professor, thanks for coming on the program.
It's a pleasure, Mitch. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we originally booked this recording with the thought that perhaps we'd have the results in by now. So I guess the first thing to do is to inform listeners of the time of this recording, which is the day after the election, Wednesday, November the 4th, and it's about 1 p.m. And right now the lay of the land is that former Vice President Biden is leading in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nevada, which seems to be enough to get him just barely to 270. But President Trump is leading in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. All those states remain yet to be called at this point. It's a tight race, way tighter than anybody thought we were going to be in at this point, I think. Were you one of those people who thought it was going to be a bit more open-ended and less of a nail-biter?
Well, yeah, actually, I have to say I was always expecting this. I wasn't sure about which states would go to which candidate, but ever since 2000 and the famous Bush versus Gore race with the hanging chads in Florida, the standard practice is for the political parties to have a platoon of lawyers, mostly volunteer, ready to challenge election irregularities. And as you know, Mitch, the 50 states plus territories like the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and so forth, all do the election administration themselves. And so even after the Hanging Chads election, it wasn't possible for us to do a massive nationwide electoral reform. Congress tried to harmonize systems and get us to use electronic systems rather than punch cards. There was some money for that. Some states adapted their policies, but really part of the reason we litigate these outcomes is that the rules have all sorts of quirks about whether a mail-in ballot can be counted after Election Day, whether it has to be postmarked by Election Day. We've never had so many mail-in voters or voters by mail because we've never had a pandemic election before. So that was an additional wrinkle. I think sometimes the U.S., it's part of our culture. It's the American way. We have fuzzy rules that we sort out by litigation well after the legislation ink has dried. And it's part of our political culture. It's not necessarily the best part of our political culture, but I did expect we'd be debating this long into at least this week, possibly into the weekend, and possibly all the way up until January 20th.
Yeah, and we should mention as well that we've got another conversation between us booked for Monday, which is only a few days from now. So hopefully we have a bit of a clearer picture. But I think you're right. We're going to have legal questions for a long time, and that's part of the beauty of a strong state system with this type of federalism is everybody gets to do it a little bit differently. You find out what works best, but at the same time, that also means that inevitably some states are going to do it poorly or do it worse than others. So 50 different states with 50 different systems plus territories, it gets a little confusing. But, you know, what we did see last night and into today is a tighter race, and specifically a tighter race in some of the Rust Belt states and some of the sort of Sun Belt states like Florida. Is there something to be read into the fact that a lot of people went out and voted for President Trump when they weren't necessarily expected to? Is there something that we perhaps missed in the election campaign about what's really going on the ground in the United States right now?
Let me answer that by first talking about what I think is maybe the most important underlying trend, which is a shift in the party bases, the base of each party. They've been stable for most of our lifetimes because we went through a long period in which the baby boomers were the largest cohort in the U.S. electorate, and they had fairly stable relationships with the Republican and Democratic parties, which had a predictable base. We knew, more or less who was in it. and new generations just sort of fell in line with the party identities, with the Republicans being for free trade, strong national defense, lower taxes, and with a social conservative element, sort of the Reagan triad. And then Democrats being the party of labor unions, of blue collar workers, and of identity politics groups, whether it were Hispanics, African Americans, and others. What we saw in this last election was a real consolidation of a shift that began with 2016. Many Republicans have been asking how the party can survive in a future in which the majority of the U.S. electorate is a minority, that is to say, an African American, a Hispanic, etc. This majority of minorities scenario had a lot of Republicans quite flustered, or at least stumped, as to how they could compete in that environment. It seemed like a fate that would guarantee Democratic domination ad infinitum, or at least for a considerably long time. Trump solved that equation by shifting the party's appeal and making it a populist and nationalist party that focuses on the working, I have to say the working man, but generally the working class, that made real gains. And in 2016, we weren't sure if that was a new normal or a fluke, but 2020 showed that the president has made real inroads with Hispanics in particular, African Americans to a considerable degree. His populism has appealed to a lot of people in a very difficult time, really going back to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. The American middle class has been whipsawed by economic trends, automation, the high-tech economy. Add to that now COVID, and you can see that there's been a lot of strain. And Trump's also introduced an important debate about globalization and positioned the party more as a critic of globalization than a cheerleader, which is a big change. Meanwhile, Democrats are also going through a big change. Their coalition is a very fractious one, with the various identity policy groups impatient for action, throw in environmentalists looking for climate change action. For them, Barack Obama said all the right things. He seemed to be moving the party in a much more progressive direction, but his ability to deliver, partly because of opposition from Republicans in Congress, wasn't so great. And at the end of those 8 years, most progressive Democrats wanted real change, and the party convinced them that Hillary Clinton, essentially a centrist figure, would deliver the change that the Obama administration's 2 terms promised. But when she lost, they started becoming much more active, and we saw that activism eventually spill over into the streets. The more central part of the party focused on all the ways that Trump might have cheated to get into office, while the sort of grassroots began thinking about how they could position the Democrats to retake Washington, or burn the whole thing down, burn the whole system down. And most Americans were someplace in between those, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. This election, the party leadership convinced the party, or anyway, engineered an outcome in which the party again had a centrist, Joe Biden, who is well known to a lot of Canadians. He's been around for a long time. His politics are fairly well known. As a candidate, Vice President Biden reached out to a lot of the progressive ideals of this faction. And if he does become president, there'll be a lot of impatience, since people don't expect him to run for re-election. A lot of impatience from those factions asking for quick action and a quick delivery on their investment in him. It's those underlying changes that I think have made the election what it is. And the third element, I think the most important element to recognize, is that millennials are now the largest cohort in the U.S. electorate. And we don't know a lot about millennials and their political views. We have various surveys. We know the progressive agenda really syncs up well with the idealism that this generation has. Being a younger generation, you expect a certain amount of that. But it's also a generation that's struggling in a tough economy, trying to get their start. They have a lot of student loan debt. Owning their own home looks really difficult because they have to build up the capital, et cetera, find the job. I think that's a big challenge for them. And as they start to have kids and settle down, they're going to look for the kinds of things that all young people do eventually, some pragmatic results. That's not to say they'll give up their idealism, but I think they're going to want a politics that leads to actual results, not endless conversations. And so for the next 4 years, what I'll be watching is the rise of a new generation of leadership, and what they are looking for And I expect that they'll consolidate this party shift. They'll have redefined what it means to be a Republican or a Democrat. The labels will be there, but they'll mean different things. And that has big implications for the relationship with Canada, but not necessarily implications that Canada can influence now. But there's certainly a real agenda before the Trudeau government and leaders of all the provinces as well, which is to get to know this new generation and rekindle the contact between Americans and Canadians, so that when this generation takes over, we'll be able to work together.
So, there's a lot there, and I think it's a really insightful answer on a number of fronts. But the kind of theme that I would take away from it would be, whether it's the minority vote or the young vote, is that it's more complex than it seems, right? I think we have this tendency in a two-party system in the U.S. to paint people as Republicans or Democrats, but that conversation, there's a lot of different factors that go into it. And so one thing that I took away from your answer there, and relating it back to Canada, because that's where I want to sort of take this conversation a little bit. The states that are close to the border, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, they went more Republican than people thought they were going to go, right? Even if they still end up voting Biden in the end, they're much closer races. We saw Ohio go Republican. It says to me that the conversation about reopening the economy, these are places that have been economically, as you mentioned, hard hit both in the '08 recession and again by COVID, that economic importance, that underlying need to get back to a properly functioning economic system, was a bit of a stronger undercurrent than I think anybody noticed. And so if President Trump wins the election, you continue to do things for those areas that are favorable towards reopening the economy. But even if Joe Biden wins the election, you've got to take a look at those states and say, why were they so close? What can we do? And so part of this seems to me, it's a bit of a long way of saying that the Buy America story is only kind of just beginning, because those are places that traditionally make things, manufacture and those sorts of industries. Where do you see Buy America going, regardless of the election, knowing how those states voted?
Well, that's a very good question. And let me answer it in a couple of ways. I think because of this churn in political support, politicians have been trying to address these sort of pressures in different ways, but for the most part, trying to basically forestall a major change. They've been trying to accommodate that change rather than necessarily respond to it, if that makes any sense. So for example, on globalization, for a long time, politicians tried to respond to that by saying it'll be okay. We just have to get through this. And so they offered, aggressive use of trade remedy law, complaints against China and Mexico, but not a lot of fundamental change. And until Donald Trump renegotiated the NAFTA agreement, and what we ended up with at the end of his first term, maybe his only term, is a kind of normal trade policy. I say that because if you look at Canada's trade policy, you could characterize it as pushing for market access in the areas where Canada is competitive and has something to export, while at the same time retaining some protections for those sectors of the Canadian economy that are struggling. That could be dairy, it could be really a range of things, softwood lumber, areas where you have a commodity and prices are unstable. That's what the U.S. essentially has shifted to. And we've been so used to the U.S. sort of preaching the gospel of free trade and markets that it sounded funny coming from Trump. And of course, led to a lot of never-Trumpers walking away. But it achieved something very important, which it built a bond between Trump and working class voters that after a lot of lip service to their problems, he was willing to actually step up and address them. But the baby boomers that appeal really was aimed at initially are retiring. Just a matter of age. So who are the millennial blue collar workers? And you see a little bit in Trump's appeal, some of the things that were aimed for them, things like the importance of low affordable energy costs, cutting regulation so that you could see innovation kickstart. And I think for a good chunk of his base, it was a small part of his campaign, but this is the first president since Gerald Ford who has not launched a war for the United States, even a small one. Now, if you're of military age and or serve in uniform, or someone in your family serves in uniform, the fact that we have not gotten to another conflict in the last 4 years is actually meaningful. And the shift towards confronting China, which suggests, like the Cold War, we're going to spend a lot of our money on deterrence rather than actual fighting, is one that I think is going to appeal to a lot of people who are in that demographic that would otherwise be fighting those wars. And I think that's another part of the shift. But going back to your question, Buy America's always been a kind of label or a bumper sticker that you put on efforts to just reassure voters who can't see where this is going to help them that, yes, well, we'll at least have Buy American. This is why it was such an issue with Obama's stimulus. He was spending a lot of money, but people thought, well, this is all going into the pockets of your friends and special interest groups. Where's this going to help us? And so Congress said, oh, well, we'll have Buy American provisions, which obviously violated NAFTA and the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and caused a lot of tension. But you understand the appeal because they wanted to placate this group. Trump's all for Buy American. USMCA or CUSMA in Canada has carved out a much bigger exception for domestic set-asides. And I think even Joe Biden has been a longtime proponent of Buy American, something that Democrats have championed for a long time, and certainly suits Biden's view of the world. He's been a kind of working class politician, certainly from his roots, for a long time. So I think Buy American is here to stay, and the question will be, can we modify it, mitigate it somehow, or carve out a Canadian exception so that it doesn't further disrupt the supply chains that we've got?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've been saying over the past couple of weeks that, Canada needs to focus a bit on trying to turn that slogan into Buy North American instead of Buy American, so that they could be, a part of that question moving forwards. But there are a couple of really interesting things you said there. The one that struck me was this cross section of both millennial and blue collar worker, right? A couple of things about what we know about the election at this point. The turnout was astronomically high. I think I saw something along the lines of it was the highest turnout in 120 years at almost about 70% of the population. So that means that millennials, who typically or to this point hadn't really been a voting force, were certainly out in numbers in the past few weeks. The other thing that struck me a bit is that some of the states that have the highest rate of infection with the pandemic still voted Republican. Ohio, notably, I think has the highest hospitalization rate it's had at any point in the pandemic right now, and yet still voted for the candidate who's most likely to reopen the economy and arguably, based on people's perception previously, has mismanaged the pandemic a little bit. I look at Canadian perception of the border and of the COVID pandemic, and I think to myself, a lot of Canadians are looking at the United States and going, it's pretty bad down there. Let's keep the border closed and be safe. You have a lot of Americans who are actually saying, let's open things up based on the way that they marked a ballot over the past few days. Are we up for a difference in conversation about the future of a closed border between the countries? Or do you think both countries are going to continue this sort of continual extension of a closed border?
That again, another fascinating question. I think that as we get close to March, which will mark a full year of not only the lockdowns and the COVID response, but also of the joint border restrictions that we've imposed, I think you're going to see two different reactions. And as you suggest, a lot of Canadians wanting to keep those restrictions in place simply because they're a tool in stopping the spread of an infection that seems to be much more virulent or much more prevalent, maybe the best way to say it, in the United States. But what's interesting about the U.S. situation is that Donald Trump has respected the federal system and said states are in charge, not only of the front lines of public health delivery, but also restriction of economic activity. And states have wanted to exercise that right to set their own rules in ways that has led to a patchwork of different COVID requirements. My wife and I went to Maine for a summer break in August, and Maine had its own unique restrictions for quarantine depending on what the rate of prevalence of COVID infections were in the state from which you were coming. And so it can be quite complicated to figure all of this out. But states like Wyoming, sort of in the center of the country, haven't had a very high incidence rate. And so they've been reluctant to maintain the kind of strict restrictions It just hasn't been a factor for them. Low population density and other things help too. So I think you can be sure that the American states are going to continue their experiments, and a lot of criticism from one side to the other, saying, "Oh, you're being too loose. Oh, you're being too strong, or you're being too restrictive." I think those kinds of debates will continue until we have something on the horizon, a vaccine, hopefully, that would allow us to actually have a resolution, and then we can think about how to move forward. But one of the things that's striking about the COVID pandemic is that it's really been a global pandemic, and globally, most countries agreed on restrictions, a remarkable thing really in human history to try to control the spread of this disease. And the experiences have varied from Sweden's attempt to have limited restrictions and herd immunity to what we saw in Taiwan and South Korea, where a disciplined population was able to really get ahead and stop the spread very quickly. Nobody's going to turn the U.S. into a disciplined population. It's not really our American way. But I think politicians here have a limited ability to shape events, and they're going to have to work with where their electorate's at. And maybe going back to the point about classes. So I'm a boring college professor and or think tanker. For me, the experience of the pandemic has meant a lot of time in my basement, but my paychecks are coming in, and I'm not worried about where I'm going to get my next meal. That is not the case for a lot of people in the working class, especially people with jobs where they work with their hands. That includes frontline healthcare workers, school teachers, my auto mechanic, and the experience of the pandemic economically, not to mention everything else, has been very tough on people in that situation. I often compare sort of my neighborhood experience. Since I know a lot of college students, I'm very popular with my neighbors because they're grouping little pods together, and they want a college student who might be able to teach a group of 12-year-olds or a group of 14-year-olds because our Montgomery County schools in Maryland are not open, and they want to make sure their kids don't fall behind. At the same time, less than a mile from my house in the District of Columbia, schools have gone online. And there was a story in the Washington Post about a single mom who has to work and leaves her two kids at home trying to do online education, but they can't afford a cable bill because our cable prices are through the roof, and so they can't afford cable broadband. And so her only device is her cell phone. So she leaves it with the kids to do their classes on her cell phone. And she recently got the bill because cell phone data charges are not cheap, and Zoom or whatever you're using takes up a lot of data, and she's not sure how she's going to pay. And so this experience is quite stark, and it has huge implications. The OECD came out with a report earlier this week that includes Canada, US, other data, and their expectation is just so far the pandemic effect on education. They estimate we'll have a 3% decline in lifetime earnings of everyone still in school. 3%. I mean, that's just in a year. Now, some of us will be able to make it back. Wealthy countries like Canada and the US will find ways, but even within our societies, there are people who are really going to be left behind. The gap, the income inequality, but also the educational inequality is going to get wider. And politics will respond to that. And I think that's one of the bits of turbulence that we can expect in both countries, but particularly in the United States.
Yeah, it's an interesting wake up for Canadian politicians as well, right? I mean, this is the first similar real election check-in of how people are feeling since the pandemic occurred, right? The last federal Canadian election was before the pandemic, and sure, there's been some provincial elections, but not in the battlegrounds of Ontario or Quebec, where a lot of the seats are won and lost. And there's something to be said about the real impact to people. I mean, the American system, for a lot of the perceived flaws that I think Canadians have, it does have regular checkpoints with the electorate, the House going every 2 years, and members of the Senate being up in those cycles as well. So, it's interesting for us to think that perhaps the pandemic response isn't as universal as leaders may have thought it was, that there are people who are really calling for reopening the economy because that's what they need for their livelihoods, right? And it really is a difference of views. As we approach, so we've got another conversation booked on Monday in which we're going to talk a little bit more about, at that point, we should hopefully know the winner of the presidency and the shakedown of the Senate and the House and all of those races. and we have a bit more of a conversation about what their policy agendas might look like moving forwards and what that means for the two countries. But I do have to ask you quickly. I big baseball fan, and there's always been this old line, and I'm not sure who originally said it, but they were talking about stealing a base from first to second, and somehow, despite years of evolution in the game and in the people who play the game, the ability to steal a base is still really close. Sometimes you're safe, sometimes you're out. If the base was 5 feet further, the runner would be out every single time. If it was 5 feet closer, the runner would be safe every single time. But somehow this harmony has worked out where the ability from the pitcher's hand to second base is the same as it takes the runner to run from first to second. The Electoral College strikes me as something similar to that, right? You've got this system where if it was more weighted on population, it would be a Biden landslide. We wouldn't even be having this conversation right now. If it was more weighted on states having a bigger say, regardless of their size, you'd be talking about Republican victories right now over and over and over again. Is the Electoral College something that needs to be refined, or is it this crazy system that just somehow works?
Oh yes, this is one of those questions that the political scientists in the faculty lounge will debate forever, like proportional representation and all of these other kind of ideas. It's an interesting. Canadians have a system that doesn't allow direct election of the chief executive. It's the traditional British system. The people elect a parliament, and parliament elects a government, and the head of the party with the majority or the plurality, in this case federally, becomes the prime minister. But most people don't vote for Justin Trudeau. Only a handful of people do in his constituency. So you're used to that separation, which was very important, I think, for political theorists at around the time our societies were founded in the 18th and early 19th century. And so this structure was designed to prevent a kind of majority rule, by making sure there was a balance. And I think questioning the Electoral College is natural for Democrats, because they've lost out in a couple of elections in a row, because while at the same time winning a majority of the overall vote. And that's because their vote is concentrated in big cities and a handful of states, which are really important to the country. And so I think they've been feeling a lot of frustration. And during this campaign, Democrats floated proposals for adding some states, especially states that they thought would guarantee Democratic senators to give them control of the Senate, for example, the District of Columbia and possibly Puerto Rico. They've talked about making revisions to the Electoral College or abolishing it entirely. They've talked about packing the Supreme Court. And all of this, I think, at least my view, is part frustration and part the very end of what has been the sort of baby boom political culture, which has been one of challenging institutions and authority from the beginning. And that was where their politics were formed, in challenging the Vietnam War and civil rights. They don't take anything as sort of just assume, oh, this is the system, I'm going to respect that. Instead, they've always challenged the boundaries. The reason I don't think any of those dramatic changes will succeed is twofold. One, the U.S. system's hard to change. Even if you wanted to change the Electoral College, you'd have to go through a constitutional amendment process to do it. And we don't make that very easy in the American system. It takes a lot to do that. And secondly, the desire to make the change is based on an assumption of what it will do for your side if implemented. And because the rise of the millennials and these shifting political party bases are creating a considerable amount of uncertainty as to what the effect of an Electoral College change or adding new states would be for voters, and for outcomes, most importantly, I think both parties will talk the talk but hold back, because it's too high a hill to climb when you don't know what the outcome will be. However, one of the great things about this election and the last couple elections and the questioning of institutions is that it's a great re-education of the American public in how government works, how their system works. And we're all proud of our right to criticize the government, whoever's in charge. And it has been great to have conversations about things like the Electoral College with students and others, including international students that I have who will say, what the heck are you doing? How does this work? And I think it's good for us to have this conversation and to think about how all the pieces fit together. But I expect that we'll stay with the system that we have, flaws and all.
Yeah, it's, you remind me of the old, I got to think it was the Ronald Reagan joke where he said one of the great things about American society is you could theoretically go right into the Oval Office and tell the president to his face that you don't like the job that Reagan's doing. And the joke is something along the lines of the Soviet leader at the time, which I'm going to say was Khrushchev, but I could be wrong, said you could do that in the Soviet Union too. You could come right into the Kremlin and tell me how bad of a job Reagan's doing. Because, there is something to be said about the re-education of the ability to challenge institutions and have these types of conversations if you do or don't like the outcome. The other thing it reminds me of is a bit of a question which I'll leave as a teaser for our next conversation, which is the rural urban divide that's happening both in Canada and the US and what that might mean for policy moving forwards. But we still got to figure out exactly what the election result looks like this time. So I think we'll leave it there today. And Professor, thanks for coming on the program.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Mitch. It's a great podcast, by the way. I'm enjoying listening to it. I just probably won't listen to me on
it. Well, there might be 2 episodes of you, so you're really going to have to skip for a couple of weeks, but appreciate the words. Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.